Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Hi, everyone. We're back for another episode of Religion in the American Experience. It's good to be with you again. This year, during America's 250th anniversary, we are discussing how religion shaped the founding of the United States and how the founding, in turn, shaped religion. Today's topic is religion and the American Revolution. As with any episode, we hope that by better understanding this particular topic, each of us will be more effective stewards of religion's role in the American experiment in self-government. Our guest today is Kate Carté, a professor of history at Southern Methodist University who specializes in early American Atlantic history and is author of Religion and the American Revolution, an Imperial History. Kate has been a Charles A. Rice Camp Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, an affiliate fellow of the Center for the Study of Religion at Princeton University, a Franklin Fellow of the American Philosophical Society, and a Barra postdoctoral fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies. Kate, thank you so much for giving us your time and your hard-earned knowledge today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
All right. Well, I read the book. It's fantastic. And there's way too much to talk about in 60 minutes. So I won't be walking us through it to get an overview for the listeners. Instead of I've picked a few things out to discuss. And basically, I just think everyone needs to either check out the book or buy it and read it before July 4th.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah. So first, Kate, what do you hope this book does?
I hope that this book takes the topic of religion in the American Revolution, which is it's a big topic that touches on a lot of different questions that are important to us politically as Americans, that it takes that question or that subject and puts it into its historical time frame, helps us think about how religion was organized before the American Revolution, how the American Revolution challenged that organization, and how the American Revolution shaped what becomes sort of the American style of church and state.
Okay. That's a tall order. Do you think it's been helpful and done that? What have you heard?
I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that.
Right. Well, it did it for me. I mean, I think it did help me put it in context. I learned a bunch of things. I've read about religion and the revolution a little bit, and a lot of stuff I didn't know, and it really was helpful. So I really do encourage our listeners to pick it up. So the first thing I noticed is this phrase or these two words, imperial Protestantism, which I hadn't really heard, but it comes up early and it comes up often. What is it exactly, and why is this critical to understand?
Well, so I think this is a context that we don't tend to think of for religion and the American Revolution. And let's take those two words separately, imperial and Protestantism. The imperial part of it is that religion for most colonists was shaped by organizations and structures that went all the way across the British Empire. So they were really linked through their religion to that empire. So that's what made it imperial. And then there's the word Protestant, and it's not a word we use a lot now. It feels kind of technical and jargony now. In a technical way, Protestants are Western European Christians who are not Catholic, right? That's a kind of broad grouping of people whose movements that spring out of the Protestant Reformation. But what it meant to people in the 18th century is a little bit different. It meant something political. It meant a way to work together politically to combat the power of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church was supposed to express that power through the French and Spanish empires, which were Catholic empires. And so British Protestants, members of this imperial Protestant system, were used to thinking of their religion as, their local faith, going to their church, all of those things. But it linked them up to the whole empire, and that whole empire was part of a project to promote true religion, and that was Protestant religion. And they used that word Protestant a lot. It was associated to things like freedom, and it was always juxtaposed to Catholic tyranny. right? So that concept of imperial Protestantism takes us to that pre-revolutionary moment when American religious life was really about being a part of the British Empire and being a part of this shared Protestant identity.
Okay. Well, I think that makes sense, well explained, and I get it. And it's something, that sort of paradigm we don't have. And that maybe is what it's a little bit difficult to get your head around, but you can get your head around it, I've found. And your explanation is helpful.
And I think one of the interesting things to juxtapose it with is how different the United States is that comes out of that system. So when the framers of the Constitution choose not to create a shared Protestant nation, right? When they do not create religious tests for federal office, things like that, they decline to create a structure that would have matched what people had before. And it means that as people move through the revolution and into the revolutionary period, they've kind of lost something that had organized their religion before, and they have to decide what to do with that. Some of them want the United States to have that kind of identity, that kind of religious identity that the British Empire had had, and some of them don't want it. Um,
Yeah.
but it means there's a real shift because that thing that had been there before is not there after.
Right. Okay. Good. Um, I thought it fascinating to read that you wrote in your book that the British Empire was, quote, coded as religious, close quote. Can you explain this?
So when I said religiously coded, what I mean there is that people thought of the British Empire as having a specific religious meaning. And that religious meaning was to combat Catholicism and spread the true religion around the world. So, and that true religion was going to be Protestant. But importantly, that coding wasn't just what sort of people on the ground assumed. It was really sponsored from the top. So the sovereign was coronated in Westminster Abbey. There's religious language in the coronation oaths that King George, all three Georges, but George III would have taken. And when policy agendas were articulated, they could be articulated as promoting true religion or promoting Protestantism. So a justification for what the British Empire did in the foreign policy realm even was promoting Protestantism. We might think of this as kind of parallel to the way Americans today think of the United States as standing for freedom, right? Or
Right.
spreading democracy, that's supposed to be a shared value, and it's acceptable and expected politically that we'll do things that promote democracy in the world. And we kind of have a
Yeah.
shared understanding vaguely of what that means. For the 18th century British Empire, that would have been about Protestantism.
Yeah, and I thought that was fascinating because I'd never really thought, as I learned about and thought about the American Revolution for so many years, I never really thought of the British as coded as religious, but they were actually. I mean, they had a religious intent. All right, so let's move to the Stamp Act. Everybody's heard of the Stamp Act crisis, and you wrote this. You wrote that the Stamp Act crisis, quote, exposed and then quickly reaffirmed the mechanisms of imperial Protestantism, close quote. What do you mean by that? What's the story here?
Well, so the Stamp Act is kind of it's famously called the prelude to revolution. It's the first big crisis between the colonies that eventually rebel and Parliament, where Parliament passes legislation, specifically legislation designed to raise money, and colonists, many colonists, not all of them, but many colonists argue that this is wrong, that it's an inappropriate use of taxation. So what happens, it's not really a religious law. There's not really much about religion in this law at all. It's a taxation law. But it makes Americans very, very angry. So first of all, when Americans are angry and they're looking for language to articulate why they're angry, religion is an important language that's there for them. So they can see this new law as a sign that the British are violating their rights, and their rights are also religious rights. It's not what right to practice religion so much as it is the right, a kind of notion of Protestant liberty, that this law is going to challenge that. But then when they use kind of the structures of imperial Protestantism to make these protests, and that includes a lot of days of fasting. So we're under this collective challenge of this illicit law. So the parallel today would be sort of a big protest or something, where we're going to collectively express our political anger, our political frustration. They did that, but then when the law is repealed, and that's a super important part of the story of the Stamp Act, the colonial protests are successful. They're not just colonial protests, there's protests in Britain too, but all of those protests are successful and the law is repealed. So because the law is repealed, it's actually evidence of the success of the British system, that British lawmakers and British policies actually do promote freedom, because when they're under threat and people react, then the response is to rectify the problem. So the outcome is actually to kind of reinforce that idea of the strength of the British system for many people. Of course, people don't forget. So when the new crises arise, it's really easy to look back and say, see, they never really moved back from where they were before, right? So if we look at it from what happens after, we see that this is act one of a longer story. But at the time, people really rejoiced. And part of that rejoicing was believing that Protestant liberty had been rescued.
Yeah. Well, and then I want to move now to the Boston Tea Party, the next part of the saga. This was so. Now, what were the religious responses to this? I think they were different. And what's the significance of those responses to this particular crisis?
So the Boston Tea Party, historians differ on when the American Revolution becomes inevitable, when things have really spun out of control to the extent that it's going to become a military problem. And I'm in the camp that argues that the Boston Tea Party is really the turning point here. And if we think about the Boston Tea Party, it's a pretty clearly illegal act of social protest, right? So even though the people who did it for what they saw as ideologically legitimate reasons, it's a destruction of property. That's really what it is. And so when the Tea Party happens, and a relatively small number of people in one place are responsible for that act, the British are appalled, because this is a violation of property, and somebody has to pay, right? Even if it's a legitimate social protest, somebody has to pay, and it should be the people who carried out the protest. So the British pass a series of acts that are they're called the coercive acts by the British. The intent is to coerce the Americans into obedience. What's really important is that at the same time, they pass another act, which is just kind of coincidental. And that coincidental act is the Quebec Act. And what it was doing was organizing territory that had been seized in the 7 Years' War from the French. And the British administration was seeking to be very liberal and embrace notions of religious freedom. And so they allowed the Catholics who had been conquered in Quebec to retain their Catholic bishop and their rights as Catholics. People in the older English-based colonies along the coast saw this as evidence that the British ministry, at the same time that it's being coercive, is pro-Catholic. So they're anti-freedom in their policies, and then they're also being tolerant of Catholics. And that's a sign that the British ministry has been corrupted. So religion becomes really important in that particular moment, because it allows people who are objecting to the British for all kinds of reasons to pull in all of these ideas that the Catholics and the Catholic menace are what's really behind the problem. And Americans have to stand up for their freedom, because Catholics and people who serve the papacy the word they always use is slavish. They are slavishly devoted to their rulers. They don't embrace freedom. So good Protestants who want freedom have to protest. Now, of course, there isn't any reality to this fear. The leaders of George III's administration who promoted this were not serving Catholic interests. They were
Right.
They were doing what they thought they needed to do in order to build what they viewed as a liberal empire. In fact, the guy who is the architect of the Quebec Act is actually an evangelical Protestant who was working very hard to serve what he saw as the best ends of religion. But that's not how it plays in the colonies. And so what happens with the Quebec Act, the coercive acts, which are really aggressive, and then the Quebec Act, which kind of gives it all the rhetorical spin it needs, it drives up the level of energy in the colonies against the British. It really unites people against the British.
Okay. But you say that the British were the Quebec Act was to build the British Empire, but there was a flavor of religious freedom that they saw, right? And that they were invoking
From the British perspective,
from
yes.
the
So
British. Yeah.
if we take things back a little bit from the British perspective, the another thing that had happened during the 7 Years' War, which is 1754 to 1763, that's not 7 years. Don't pay attention to that fact. That during that war, the British had decided to cleanse Acadia, Nova Scotia, of Catholics because they thought Catholics couldn't be good citizens. And this is where we get the Cajun population, right? So they expel tens of thousands of French Catholics who had been for generations in Nova Scotia in that area. They kick them out, and some of them go back to France, some of them go to other places. They go sort of all over the place. It's a moment of great religious persecution because the British believe in the 1750s that Catholics cannot be good settlers in their colonies. They're willing to have Protestants come in from Germany and France, but they do not want Catholics. So that actually hadn't worked out very well, and it had been pretty illiberal. It had looked pretty bad. It's an act of ethnic cleansing. And so after the war's over in 63, they don't require all of the Catholics who are in the territories they take from France to become Protestant. They try to create a space where those people can be loyal Catholic subjects to the British monarchy. Right? What does that look like? Can they carry weapons? What kind of religious practice can they have? If they have a bishop, what kind of power does that bishop have? Right? Like they're trying to work out what it means to let these Catholics still live there. That's the aim from the perspective of the British Empire. They're trying to be what we would call liberal minded, right?
Yeah.
But that's not how it's read by the colonists.
Interesting. Okay. Um, you write that between 1763 and 1776, as it plunged into disarray and war, those are your words, Britain called for no special days of fasting or Thanksgiving. What does this signify?
So, days of fasting and Thanksgiving were called for moments of great collective political import. So, for instance, again during the 7 Years' War, when the British conquer Quebec, there's a truly imperial-wide day of Thanksgiving to celebrate this great moment of British patriotism, and you want to go to church and hear sermons about the greatness of British military strength and how God has shined on the Protestant cause as they have since the Spanish Armada, right? This kind of religious coding. So those are days of Thanksgiving, and days of fasting are when things are going really badly. And so, classically they're called for things like earthquakes and pestilences and things like that, which can be seen to be acts of God if you're interpreting things providentially, right? God is punishing us through this, so we need to have a day of collective atonement. But war is another reason to do that. The fact that the British don't do that during the time that the Americans are actually doing it a lot, because the Americans are kind of getting worked up about these issues and moving towards war, it suggests that on the one hand, they're not completely unified about the British are not completely unified about what they're doing. There is a lot of internal disagreement within Britain about how to approach this problem. And it also kind of puts it at a distance. It doesn't have a clear religious meaning. So the British actually don't declare a day of fasting for the American War until after the Declaration of Independence. So a full year after I think it's in December of 76. So it's well over a year after the fighting breaks out. There are tens of thousands of British troops in the colonies. But until the Americans declare independence, the meaning of that fight isn't clear for the British, right? Is it a civil war? To what extent do the Americans have good points that need to be taken into consideration? And the Americans are part of shared churches with the British, right? So there are a ton of Church of England Anglicans in the colonies, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, all these groups that are kind of the core groups in Britain. They're also there in the colonies, and so it's hard to get a clear religious meaning until the colonists declare independence. And independence it's a really significant moment because it says to the British that the colonists are just through and through disobedient, and subjects do not get to be disobedient. That's wrong as far as they're concerned.
So all the while that the British did not see this as a religious threat or a religious movement the Americans or the people on the continent did in America. Is that
Well,
accurate or not?
they're trying to.
They're
Because
trying to. Okay.
what the Americans are trying to do is so much harder than what the British are trying to do, right? So the Americans are trying to create a new country and fight off an empire that they themselves have seen as the best empire, right? So what they're trying to do is really hard when you think about how to frame it politically.
The best
Many
empire
Americans.
and
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, the best empire and God's empire.
Absolutely God's
Yeah.
empire, right? So now they're having to turn against this. And we need to remember that Americans were in no way unified about the American Revolution. So historians guess that about 20% of Americans were firmly in favor of the American Revolution, 20% were firmly opposed. And those were people who had sort of taken ideological positions on it. And then 60% of Americans were somewhere in between, right? And for most of those people, not just the 60%, but actually all Americans, those views are going to change over time, right? As different things happen, so, something can happen that can change your view of things, and something can happen else that changes your view back, right? So the tools of religion are really powerful tools as leaders of the American cause are trying to pull Americans together to fight the British, or pull Americans together to support the British and put down the revolution, right? Both of those sides are going to try to pull in religious arguments. They're just really important tools. And so we see the leaders using those tools. Now, it's a kind of public way of understanding religion.
Yeah.
I think through all of this time, as we would expect for all people of faith everywhere, individuals were struggling with their own challenges, their own traumas. Pastoral care continued to be very important on a local level, right? So you imagine clergy serving the needs of a particular community and thinking of that community's local needs, right? But on top of that, there's this political layer that we see more in sort of days of fasting and Thanksgiving and sort of more public alliances between church institutions and the government.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's jump to the General or Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And I want to ask, how did religious institutions and political leaders employ public religion to validate these?
So the Continental Congress is a totally new body, right? And from the perspective of the British Empire, it's an illegal body, right? It's a group of people locally chosen by whatever mechanism they felt was appropriate, who come together, who start acting like a government, right? And they raise a military force. They appoint Washington to lead the military force. They're acting like a government, but they're extra legal would be what we would call them, right? Until they can establish their legitimacy. So as they tried to establish their legitimacy, they use religion, and I think we shouldn't see that cynically. I think on the one hand, they were making sure that they moved carefully. These are all pro-revolution actors, right? These are the people who are in the Congress are people who are supporting the movement that's there. People who opposed the revolution were not members of the Continental Congress. So these people are all pro-revolution, but they know what they're doing is big and scary. And so they pause and try to frame things in ways that they can justify morally. And for them, that meant moral justification within the framework of their religion, within their Protestant background. So I think they do that seriously for themselves, even though they themselves are they're internally to Protestantism, they come from a lot of different church backgrounds. They were not theologically unified, but they were all Protestant. Then they also use it functionally. So as they use it for themselves, they also hope to offer those tools to the American public and say, you will now, we'll have this day of fasting where we will, stop and think about what we've done that's sinful and make sure that we're going forward in an appropriate way, right? What that does actually is open up a kind of moment of conscience for people who didn't support the revolution, because then they can say, it's against my religion to do this thing that you're asking me to do. You're asking me to, omit prayers for the king from the Church of England service, for instance. I can't do that as part of my oaths as a clergyman in the Church of England. I can't abjure that oath, right? So it opens up this moment of conscience. So the use of religion by the Continental Congress, one of the things it does is make it make the American Revolution a conscience question for people. It gives them the language. It gives them the moment when they're going to articulate those things as a conscience question. And I think that's really important because we do see people objecting to the revolution pretty vigorously. It is a violent and bloody and nasty neighbor on neighbor fight, right? So there are real legitimate moral reasons why someone would say, do not support those people. Those people are harming their neighbors in the name of some abstract political cause.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, let's jump to Jacob Duchesne's, I think that maybe is how you pronounce his last name, Jacob Duchesne's sermon and prayer. Can you share the content and meaning, like the background of it and the content and the meaning of that? I think it seems significant in your book.
So Jacob Duchesne for me is one of these fascinating figures. He's kind of a historian's dream. He's partly that because he was a genuinely nice person, and even people who didn't like him or who very much objected to his political choices gave him the benefit of the doubt. And that tells us that he was a person that people like to believe, right? So he was an Anglican minister, a member of the Church of England, but he was the grandson of a mayor of Philadelphia. So he was a long-time Pennsylvania family. His family had been in Philadelphia for a long time. Yeah. And but as a Church of England minister, he was in kind of an interesting spot. And when the Continental Congress, actually the First General Congress in 74, when they are when they want to come together and pray at the beginning of their sessions to kind of make sure that they're acting appropriately, what they do is argue that somebody proposes that that they should do this, they should have a prayer, and somebody else says, no, don't do that because we don't all agree on theology. How are we going to pick a minister? Because we're from different churches, we're all different kinds of Protestant. How are we going to do this? Right. And Samuel Adams, who was, an old Bostonian kind of, for some reason we always call him Crusty. I'm not sure why we call him Crusty, but I think that kind of slightly rigid, sort of puritanical image works for him. Samuel Adams says he can listen to prayer from anyone who is a true lover of his country. So think about what that means, putting country ahead of theology, right? If you have the right politics, I'll listen to your prayer. And somebody else says, this is in Philadelphia, there's this nice guy down the road, young guy, Jacob Duchesne, he can come and pray. So he comes and he prays before the Congress. And this moment, it's in stained glass, actually, in Philadelphia, I think it's in Christ Church in Philadelphia. They we're in the 250th, for the 150th, they commissioned this window and put it up in their church. So he came and led a prayer, but he did it in his Church of England clothing, and he did the prayer that was appropriate for the Church of England liturgy on that day. So think how symbolic that is, right? The kind of essence of British Protestantism is supporting this revolutionary moment. So you get the kind of imprimatur of traditional values, traditional meaning British Protestant, on this moment of revolution, right? So, and it's apparently it was just an incredible prayer, and people were very, very touched by it.
Do we know what he said?
We know, I'm not going to remember offhand what the Bible verse was, but we know what text he preached on. Okay. He also did other important sermons as well. He becomes a leading minister, and we have some of his published sermons. He becomes a leading minister of the revolutionary movement, and he tends to strike this kind of cautious revolutionary spirit where he supports revolution, but he doesn't support violence. He's not radical or dismissive of the other view, right? He's cautious and kind of brings people along, saying it's okay that we have struggles collectively about what we're doing here, but the right thing to do is to protest. So he's in that space.
Okay. How revolutionary was Samuel Adams' statement? I mean, was that sort of where did he come up with it? Was that
that's a really interesting question. I think of it as a sign of what's really revolutionary about the American Revolution, from my perspective, which is that it sets up this the creation of what we now consider secular citizenship, right? So we are citizens of the United States by virtue of having sworn allegiance to its institutions, but we have no religious qualifications for that citizenship. Historically, European nations had religious qualifications in order to participate in the civil body, right?
Yeah.
So they weren't always religiously uniform, but if you weren't a part of the religious body that governed the country, you had no political rights. In the United States, your political rights don't come from the fact that you're of a particular religion. What Sam Adams is saying there when he says anyone who's a friend to country, I'll hear any sermon from a good Christian who's a friend of country or whatever. That what he's getting at there is that what unites us politically should be ahead of our religious difference. Now, in his moment, religious difference really meant the difference among pretty traditional Protestant groups.
Yeah.
So he didn't mean anyone can make up their own religion. But he did mean that for his purposes in that moment, nation was more important
Than religious difference.
than religious difference.
Would that have included Catholics? There were no were there Catholics in that?
There are Catholics do serve in the Continental Congress. I don't think at that. I'm trying to remember it. So the question is always Charles Carroll of Carrollton from Maryland. I don't remember if he's at that meeting. He is later in the Continental Congress. Right. They did, when they were setting up who should be at the Continental Congress, religion was not a primary qualifier. And importantly, George Washington did not ever put religious qualifications on who could serve in the military, which I think is super important because historically there had been qualifications on who could bear arms. Catholics could not fight in the British Army except in very specific circumstances. Jews were often deprived of military service across Europe. So this idea that you didn't care what somebody's religion was when they joined the military matters. Keep in mind, they did care about your race. So it's not that they were open to all comers, but religion specifically was not a qualifier. And then really quickly, it becomes clear that if the Americans are going to win, they're going to need the help of the French, and the French are Catholic. And so being anti-Catholic is a non-starter once the revolution is really going.
Okay. Let's see, Kate, you write this. In 1775, there was no scaffolding of American national religion because there was no nation. What did American leaders do to employ public religion, and how did they do it?
So when I use the term scaffolding to describe religion in the British Empire, what I'm talking about are all of the ways that religious institutions were oriented around the empire. But those orientations, those organizational structures, connected mostly from a colony back to England. And remember, Britain had, I think, 26 colonies at the time of the American Revolution. So only half of the British colonies rebel. There weren't structures that formally connected religious groups across colonies in a meaningful way. There's a couple coordinated groups, but basically not. Most of the organization runs through London. So when the 13 colonies that rebel, there's nothing specific. There's no way, for instance, for a person who supports the American Revolution in New Hampshire through their church to get in touch with like-minded people in Georgia, right? There's no national body that brings people together. So the Continental Congress does a lot through days of fasting and Thanksgiving, especially, and through religious language to kind of conjure that notion. And then as the war unfolds, and then especially after the war, religious institutions form that kind of give a meaning to the United States, that say, here, we're now a country. We need to have a shared religious body. So like the Presbyterians create an architecture for the Presbyterian Church in the United States. And the Church of England does the same thing in the American Church in the creation of the Episcopalian Church, right? So they have to create those structures. Okay, got it. Yeah, you use scaffolding a lot as you describe imperial Protestantism. So I appreciate that definition, or you explaining that a little bit. Okay, so what is the high-level content and significance of Witherspoon's Fast Day Sermon, The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men, and John Dickinson's first draft of the Articles of Confederation? So those two documents that happen almost at the same moment. And I think they really kind of crystallize a couple competing ideas about religion in the American Revolution. So on the one hand, in what John Witherspoon does, and John Witherspoon he's sometimes considered a founding father. He's the only ordained clergy person to serve in the Continental Congress. And he was the president of Princeton and a theologian, right? So he's the person who's most religiously educated, who's kind of leading this movement. And in this particular fast day sermon, Dominion of Providence, what he does is argue that God's providence supports the American side in the war, right? So, that's an open question, right? When you're in a war, which side is God going to be on? Both sides are going to try to make the case. So he makes the case that that God is on the American side. And then he does this other really interesting move where he sidesteps all of the stuff that he had united the Brits and the Americans as Protestants. And he sets aside this long history of the way the British Empire had supported Protestantism. And they have a long list of historical events that they can kind of name check to say, remember, we're good Protestants and we're on God's side. The Spanish Armada, the Glorious Revolution, right? These are all signs that God favors the British. He sidesteps all of that and he creates the idea, or he articulates, I wouldn't say he's the first one to create it, but he articulates the idea that the United States is a nation that has God's favor, and that should be rooted in a kind of biblical narrative rather than in a Protestant narrative, right? So on the one hand, it's an older tradition, right? Because, the Bible and those kinds of references predate the Protestant Reformation. It predates the Catholic Protestant split. But it's also really innovative because it's suggesting to Americans that there's a new way to think about the place of their nation in God's providential plan, right? So that's really important. It kind of conjures this notion of a divinely favored nation. Now, if it's going to be a Christian nation, what kind of Christian is it going to be, right? The devil's always going to be in the details. So this is a kind of Witherspoon's articulating kind of a high level U.S. as Christian sort of story. John Dickinson is a governor. He's a lawyer and a small g governor, not a governor of a state, but a person who's working on governing. And he's trying to draft the Articles of Confederation. And what he wants to do is say, what kind of laws about religion should we have in this new country we're creating?
Right.
So he tries to figure out what that should look like. Religious freedom sounds like a really good thing. Yes, we should have religious freedom. What does that look like, right? What is it actually going to mean? Well, some states have very clear religious establishments, especially in New England. Some states have always had religious establishments, but they're kind of falling apart right now because they were Church of England establishments in the South. In New England, members of the Church of England are disadvantaged. In the South, Presbyterians and Congregationalists and Baptists are a little bit disadvantaged, especially Baptists. So are they going to get to keep those rules? What does religious freedom mean? And so Dickinson looks at this situation and he says, we can't. Every state is going to be able to keep its colonial religious establishment. Whatever nation we're building, we're not going back and undoing more than a century of colonial religious law. That's not something the United States can do at this moment of revolution, is actually ask every one of these separate jurisdictions to systematize and make uniform their laws about religion when they're invested in them and they have very different structures. So he just kind of backs up from it. So we have these two really conflicting ideas. We have some sort of ethereal, the United States should be Christian, but it's completely non-institutional. And then on a practical level, no way to smush this into a common shape without dividing people, without causing the revolution to break down into disarray. And so we get that kind of conflicted narrative going forward. A sense that maybe people in leadership want some sort of Christian focus or believe that religion should be important to the nation, but no way to actually put it into practice.
Fascinating. I didn't know about those two things seen together. So that's great. All right, let's move to this. You have a chapter entitled "The War's Consequences for Protestant Communities," and in that chapter, you write that, quote, "The war of the North American landscape can be outlined in the damage done to its religious architecture," close quote. Can you elaborate on this, Kate? I thought this was super insightful.
So, there's an old idea that the United States actually went through a pretty serious religious depression during the Revolution, and I think we kind of need to bring that idea back. Um, there's the so during the Revolution, there's a lot of war. It's a war, and every city in the United States is occupied first by the Americans, and then by people who support revolution, and then by the British. And armies march across lots of spaces. Basically, all of those spaces, churches are the biggest buildings. They house
Yeah.
enormous resources, and they can be used by armies in very effective ways. And so a lot of the churches are burned. Sometimes churches are targeted, but less often than you think. More often it's that there's a case, I think it's either Westchester County or New Jersey, somewhere in the what we would now consider the broad New York metro area. The steeple is just taken down, and it's a wooden steeple, and it's taken down and used for firewood because it's winter and it's cold, and that's a structure that has a lot of carbon in it that can be used for heat, right? An army comes in, and there's 500 people who need housing, and you can shove 150 of them into this church. So let's do that. And then they damage the church, and they burn the pews and all that. Not necessarily because they're targeting religion, but because
Right.
it's a war, and wars are really destructive. Um,
Yeah.
it also dissipates congregations, right? So congregational life is highly disrupted. Church of England clergy, which is the largest group of clergy in the colonies, a lot of them flee because they support the British. So congregations dissolve. And so we have in the record base, you'll often see records for a congregation up till 75. And then if the book survives, someone will like draw a line through the page, turn the page over, and the church records start again in 83 or 85 or something like that. Because there was no one to keep the records. And so we don't really know. But think about what that means for pastoral life and congregational life, which is where most people live in terms of religion.
Right.
It's very
Yeah.
disruptive.
Yeah. Okay. A lot to think about there. And I guess also I just thought churches had steeples, and if you get up there, you could see far, right?
Yeah, that's
Uh,
also true, right?
yeah.
As architecture, they're really interesting spaces, right? And you can see why they would be used militarily.
Yeah. And you said that it wasn't necessarily that they were trying to destroy churches or places of faith, right? That they just needed them, and war is destructive. Was there any sense of either, especially of the British side, if they were able to occupy religious spaces, that was fairly symbolic, that was very symbolic for them to be there in that American religious space, or not so much?
So I think as we need to remember that the nature of that imperial Protestantism is that spaces, for the most part, were not a religious space that belonged to one side or the other. They were shared, right? I mean, literally, so the King of England has had the copyright on the Bible. King James Bible, right? It's inherited. The King of England controls where the Bible is printed, and he gives that contract to Oxford and Cambridge, and he shares it between those two churches. Nowhere are those two universities. Nowhere else in the British Empire prints the Bible. So all of the Bibles that are in the colonies, the first American Bible is printed during the American Revolution. The English Bible is printed during the Revolution, and this is why, right? Because before that, all the Bibles are printed in England. So there were, even if you were walking into a church that you're a British soldier, you've been sent over from Britain, and you're angry at the Americans that you're in this position, the Bible that's there could just as well have been in the congregation you grew up in, right? So
Yeah.
it's really a shared tradition. Now, there's one caveat to that, or actually two caveats. One is New England. Um, the British like to blame the war on either those crazy Puritans, right? And the crazy Puritans had started the English Civil War, and they burned witches at Salem, and they never get away from, or they didn't burn them. They killed witches at Salem. They hanged them. They never get away from the stain of that fanaticism. And so New England churches come in for a little bit of targeting because of that. The other
Mm.
caveat is that English people are used to blaming Scots for rebellion. And so there's a little bit of evidence that Presbyterians are targeted. by English people who are mad at Scots. But that's a different kind of fight. That's importing shared British baggage into an American context.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see. You write somewhere in your book, I don't write where here. The American Revolution was the final punctuation on the confessional era, the centuries during which European imperial politics were framed by the competitions between Protestants and Catholics. So, what are you saying here? And I think you've talked a little bit about this, but elaborate here a little bit.
So the best figure to use to understand this is actually Benedict Arnold, who is,
That was my next question. Perfect.
yeah,
Okay.
we think of Benedict Arnold as a traitor, right? That's famously he's a traitor. And Benedict Arnold was one of, and he kind of was a traitor. He was into it for himself. So unlike Jacob Duché, who I'll describe as an honorable person, Benedict Arnold made enemies in a lot of places. But Benedict Arnold, when he gets caught in his treason, claims that the reason he did what he did is because the Americans had made an alliance with the Catholic French. And that at the end of the day, whatever the beef was between the British and between the Parliament and the colonies, it did not justify making alliance with the papists, the Catholic French, who would inevitably undermine liberty. And so if you view the world as most Europeans, Western Europeans had since the Reformation, as a struggle, a providential struggle between Protestant and Catholic powers, if you're viewing the world in that way, you always have to make sure you're on the right side in that partisan fight. And when the Americans make the alliance with the Catholic French, and when the Americans start working towards what becomes secular citizenship, they make that old fight kind of irrelevant. And when Benedict Arnold tries to leverage this argument that you need to be on the side of the Protestants, it doesn't work. Americans don't buy it. Americans, they depict him as a devil. They depict him as two-faced. They do the same thing that Witherspoon did. They go back to sort of biblical narratives and sidestep that whole Protestant Catholic fight. The Protestant Catholic fight is just not relevant to the American Revolution. It had dominated political language for the British Empire for well over a century, but it is just not relevant at that moment. And so it's the end of it, right? And it's not the end of it because it was a deciding factor. It's the end of it because people are concerned about other questions and they're just not interested any longer.
So when you say confessional era, that is this Catholic Protestant.
Yeah, it's kind of the confessional era is kind of a technical historical term, but yeah, that's the term that historians used for defining in European history the difference between the Protestant confession and the Catholic confession. They would describe
Okay.
those two systems as confessions. That's the word they used for it. And it's because those, if we think of the Augsburg Confession or the Westminster Confession, right? There are these statements of faith that
Okay.
define the Reformation era,
Got
and
it.
that's where the term comes from.
So you say it faded in relevance not because it wasn't important. It just there were more important things on people's minds than that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
It no longer organizes politics for people.
Yeah. Okay. I want to jump to the new states' early attempts to define their religious boundaries, including Virginia's, which seems to be the one that does the most and has a meaning in your book's perspective, different than what we usually think. Can you explain?
So, um, Virginia gets the most press in terms of religious freedom. I actually want to give a plug here for a great book, an edited collection about disestablishment, about the process of changing laws about religious establishment in the early republic. It's a book edited, I think it's just called Disestablishment in the New United States or something like that. But it's edited by Jonathan Den Hartog and Carl Esbeck. And what they did in that project was go through and look at every state and the way it worked through its religious legal systems. And it turns out Virginia, although we give it the most attention, Virginia was not, Virginia didn't define things for other states. Virginia kind of, because Jefferson and Madison are involved in the separation of church and state in Virginia, we talk about it a lot. But it follows sort of the same general patterns as other places. And that is to say that in each jurisdiction, governors, legislators had to come together and decide what they wanted, what privileges they wanted religious institutions to have, which religious institutions should have them, what role the government should have in overseeing those institutions, and who would do the work of monitoring things and also the work of things like poor relief and education that had historically been done by churches if there was no established church. And every place has to work that out. And in every place, it's hard. It's a complicated set of decisions about the interests in that particular place.
Okay. Sounds like a good book. Let's see. In a section called Splintering Nation from National Religion, you write that political and religious leaders under the Articles of Confederation used words that implied institutional connections that no longer existed. They conjured up memories of a Protestant empire like the shadow pain of an amputated limb. Quite a sentence. I loved it. Tell us more here. I think it's important.
So I think what I was referring to there is that in the Articles of Confederation, the one mention of religion is that the states will go to war for each other on behalf of religion. And we see references like that in some of the state constitutions where they'll say things like, I think it's South Carolina that says the state has a Protestant establishment in a short-lived constitution, which they then throw out. But there is no institutional heft underneath those statements through which a system could define what counts as religion, what counts as acceptable, a legitimate reason to fight on behalf of religion, for instance. Who gets to define that? None of those institutional structures are there. So you kind of see some of that language at the top, but there's no way to put it into practice. And in fact, in United States history, one of the things that is most consistent is we argue over which groups get religious protection for what kinds of behaviors. What does religious freedom actually mean? How far should a law entangle the government and the state? These are things we've never come to a conclusion about. And those questions were much simpler in a system with one clear established church.
Yeah. Okay. So you write this on the second to last page of your book, quote, at the same time as regular pronouncements from prominent clergy of the new nation's prophetic destiny suggested that legal shift, disestablishment in the Bill of Rights, no national church, did not fully eliminate the memory of or the desire for a nation defined by religious unity, close quote. Can you talk to us about that tension?
I think, we hear a lot of argument today about, was the United States a Christian nation? Was it intended to be a Christian nation? We have that political fight. And it's a very difficult issue to weigh in on as a historian because there are two answers. One is that the institutions do not create a kind of religious structure that supports a clear religious nation, and they knew what that had looked like. But what I'm getting at in that statement is that a lot of people in creating the United States, even if they could not figure out how or in what way, or even if they wanted to make that nation sort of officially religious, they were used to religion being a place that defined how important the nation was. They felt comfortable going to church and hearing sermons about how God favored their leaders' foreign policy. And they didn't want to stop that, even though the foreign policy of the country was no longer going to be officially of one kind of religion or connected to one kind of church in a particular way. So nation, as it comes out of the Revolutionary era, is a secular concept, right? If we think about it on the broadest terms, we are often as political, in our political language, we expect nations to be neutral on questions of religion. And not be sort of theocratic, right? And you can think of the negative example of Iran here in our political rhetoric. But creating that idea and telling people not to invest it with religious spirit is really challenging. And so people wanted some of that. They wanted to believe that the nation that they were creating was was doing what God wanted, right? Was on the right path in terms of providential history. Um, that creates a gap, right? Because there's no one at the center to articulate what that means or make it
Yeah.
practical in any way. It just becomes kind of a hope.
I think that what you wrote there and how you explained it is really, really, really helpful. So
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Very, very helpful. So as we conclude, that sounded like a concluding a discussion, but as we conclude, maybe there's more. Do you want to share, Kate, any lessons or takeaways, additional lessons or takeaways from your book, either in terms of important historical transformations you have noticed or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Um, well, so the book came out 5 years ago. And since that time, at that time, I was very concerned with thinking about institutions and the national and the imperial level, right? This kind of high level discussion. Um, Something that I really left out of that book, and here I'm actually going to make a plug. Something I really left out of that book that's very important is the way that individuals' lives were impacted by the American Revolution. I did not really talk about the religion of individuals or
Right.
the way individual congregations were affected. And I'm really thrilled to say that the University of Virginia Press is about to publish a book called Revolutionary Turns: Religion in America's Founding Era. It's coming out in the next few weeks. There's a series of essays about religion in the American Revolution that really tries to get at some of those questions. Some of the ways that, for instance, indigenous Christians navigated a war that had relatively little to do with them politically. How in a religious context did they interpret that war? The way that anti-slavery sentiment was shaped by the American Revolution. These are really important questions. Household religion. If you believed that a father should pray with his family, how did those prayers change over the course of the Revolutionary era? Those things are all really important questions that tend to be at a different sort of level than the kind of
Yeah.
highest imperial political stuff, but they actually have a lot more to do with how actual people might have experienced the war.
Okay. Maybe we can put that information in the show notes.
That'd be great.
Yeah. Okay, Kate, you have the last word, and it was a great one. We have been talking with Kate Carté, a professor of history at Southern Methodist University and the author of Religion and the American Revolution, An Imperial History. Kate, thank you so much. I really do think that what you have presented today, the answers to the questions, have in turn equipped all of us listeners to be better stewards of religion's role in perpetuating the American experiment in self-government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I really appreciate being a part of this conversation.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stephens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.